We need to eat lots of different foods, and if you have a look at the Australian Dietary Guidelines, they're very broad, but they're all very evidence-based. So we know a lot about the types of vitamins, minerals, the types of fats, the types of carbohydrates and proteins that we need to function.
G'day, and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today we are discussing diet and nutrition with Associate Professor Lesley Wicks from the University of Newcastle. Hello Lesley, and welcome to Wellbeing.
Oh, hi. Thanks for having me today.
What is nutrition?
So nutrition is, broadly speaking, it's the process of us getting the foods that we need to provide us with the energy and key nutrients we need so that we operate at our highest potential.
What makes a food nutritious?
A range of things. And in my opinion, and the way I look at food, food has nutrients that are part of it, biological factors, carbohydrates, fats, proteins and individual micronutrients, and those things are important too for all various different functions in our body. But food is more than that. And I think the idea of nutrition, which comes from a long time ago, the same root word as nursing, and it's about nurturing. Food is more to us than just the small constituent parts that make it up. If you took it into a lab and broke it down into its biological constituents, you can come up with a profile of that food. But food is more than that. Food is how we express ourselves. It's how we commiserate. It's how we celebrate. It's how we identify ourselves with a group of people or a community or a population. It's how we express many meanings, and it's how we establish many relationships. So what makes a food nutritious is both the individual parts of it, those biological constituents, and they're essential for our body to operate effectively, but it's also the way that we cook it, the relationships we have, the way that we eat it, the way that we think about it, and the types and choices of foods that we make.
What does food do to the body? How does it affect it?
Okay, so in a really wide range of ways. So it's your basic form of nourishment. We need to eat regularly, and we need to have a wide range of foods in the way that we eat. So we need to have food because it's our basic source of energy. So just like you put fuel into your car, because if you run out of petrol, it stops on the side of the road. If we don't eat food, we don't get those basic carbohydrates, fats and proteins that can lead to energizing our body. So we get very run down, we get very fatigued. And obviously, in a horrendous situation, we would ultimately stop functioning completely. So food is essential. Some of it's about the energy, and a lot of it is about the types and sources of energy and the best sources of energy for us. Some of it's also about the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals. And most of these things that are really essential that we get from food, we need to because we can't make them in our body ourselves. So we can't take the basic building blocks of some of the vitamins and turn that into something. We must source it from our food. So it's essential to every aspect of how we function.
We highlighted there some of the positive effects of food, but what if someone has poor nutrition? How can that affect the body?
Well, we need to eat lots of different foods, and if you have a look at the Australian Dietary Guidelines, they're very broad, but they're all very evidence-based. So we know a lot about the types of vitamins, minerals, the types of fats, the types of carbohydrates and proteins that we need to function. And that's explained by the sorts of foods we ask you to eat, which is foods that are from fruits and vegetable food groups, from dairy, from meat, choosing unsaturated fats and oils, breads and cereals, all sorts of foods. Give us a matrix of different nutrients that we need. If you're not eating particularly well, if you don't have a diet that's varied and takes from those core food groups, then you might be running a bit low on some of those essential vitamins and minerals. You might feel a bit fatigued. You might end up not functioning at your highest potential. And we see things like kids that don't come to school having breakfast, can't concentrate as well. We know that if you go all day without eating, that your productivity can be reduced. So you're not functioning at your maximum, or even at some cases at a minimum. Sometimes when people aren't eating particularly well, they're not looking. Their body's looking for missing nutrients, and they can always feel hungry. They can always feel tired. There's symptoms to it. sometimes if you're eating a diet that is not particularly nutritious, so it hasn't got a lot of those core food groups, you can end up putting on unnecessary weight, and that can lead to other chronic disease problems. So not eating a diet that is, a big basic diet that's got lots of different foods in it can lead to some short-term and some quite significant long-term health concerns.
Do our nutritional needs change as we age?
Yeah, they do. And that's really, a lot of it has to do with, especially when we're young, with what we need to grow. So when we're born, babies have obviously rely very heavily on breast milk. Their digestive system isn't such that they can eat complex solid foods. And as they grow, we introduce those more complex solid foods to us. And they're growing at an accelerated rate at different stages in their childhood. And so at those different stages, they're going to need increased amounts of protein and energy in order to do all that extra work the body's doing to grow and develop effectively. As we go into adulthood, it's more about a maintenance phase. So we need to have all of those nutrients, but we don't probably need quite the same levels of energy that we might have when we were a child, or protein when we were growing. I can remember when my son was going through that accelerated teenage growth phase, and you just couldn't keep food up to him. He was just so hungry because he was just growing so much. When we get a bit older, going into sort of the 50s to 70 years, the profile or the sort of the mix of nutrients that we're looking for change. That's particularly so for women who, for example, when they're in their adult phase, have got quite high iron needs because they're menstruating, and they have quite high micronutrient needs if they're thinking about having a baby or going into pregnancy. As you're going into older age, again, what we're looking at here is a change in the way the body functions, and we start to see a movement away from muscle mass into fat mass, and natural aging occurs, and that changes your nutrient profile needs as well.
How well in Australia are we eating?
Well, if you were to look at the latest sort of national nutrition survey that the government put out, in some areas not particularly well. And the ones that are probably not, the areas of food that we're not eating particularly well in is really fruits and vegetables. So if you could sort of make a general statement, Australians just don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, and fruit less so than vegetables. And we really want Australians to eat 5 or 6 serves of vegetables a day, and that's not necessarily what we're seeing people doing. The other thing that we can see when we look broadly speaking across populations is that people eat a lot of what we call discretionary choices. So these are the foods that might be high in fat or sugar, high in salt. They're not particularly nutritious, so they don't have a lot of nutrient backgrounds to them, but they're very high in energy. And so those sort of snacking foods, that we see that Australians eat quite a bit more of those than we would like to see. We would like you to have sort of 1 or 2 a day, and people can be eating up to 4, 5 or 6 at a population level, some people even more than that.
What are some reasons, do you think, as to why Australians may not be eating enough fruit or vegetables?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. And I don't know that there's a lot of research out there about why definitively. I think there would be differences based around gender divide. There would be differences based around ages. There's certainly groups of people that are challenged to get access to the sorts of foods we're talking about. We're talking then about people who are living more remotely, regionally or remotely, and they might not have good food supply going into their groups. So I think there's probably a really big range of reasons why people aren't. And at the moment, one of the biggest things might just simply be the cost. So with every change to our economic processes, there's a change to the impact on the food supply, and that causes fluctuations in expenses, and that might have an impact on the choices that people are making at the moment.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Professor Lesley Wicks, where we are discussing diet and nutrition. What you just mentioned there with the price levels, how affordable is it to eat well in Australia?
Look, it can be quite affordable, and there are, especially in cities with really good food supplies, but it can be in different places with different people's level of income. It can actually be a challenge. So sometimes people need to be really quite creative and quite innovative in the way they go about choosing the foods that they are going to eat. But there are always really good choices available to us that can help us here. Frozen foods and canned foods, while people sometimes think aren't as good for us as fresh foods, they can be quite good at in a cheap and effective way of getting a good nutritious eating pattern.
Is the food industry really trying to provide good nutrition?
Oh, that's a controversial question. And I don't do a lot of food industry work, but you can see that a lot of different groups within dietetics and a lot of different groups in public health are really advocating for changes to the way the food industry is regulated, changes to the way media representation of foods occur, especially into young children. So this is not what I would call one of my areas of specialty, but I think that you could look at public opinion and you could look at some of the advocacy groups, and they would really like to see perhaps a different framework for the way the food industry engages with us.
In Australia, why do you think, was it non-discretionary foods that you mentioned, like junk foods and all that?
Discretionary choices.
Discretionary choices.
Yep.
Why do you think those are quite popular in Australia?
Well, one of the ways that we often think about those discretionary choices is as hyper-palatable foods. So these foods, hyper meaning high and palatable meaning tasty. So these foods are often very high in salt, very high in sugar, very high in fat. And the food properties of those particular nutrients they're important nutrients. If you eat them within a balanced eating pattern, they're quite good for you. And you have to have sodium, you have to have fat in your diet. But if you eat foods that are very high in those, that they don't have other nutrients present, they can lead to high energy intakes, but they taste to us very enjoyable, and we associate them, I think, perhaps with some of those celebratory factors. It's a snack. It helps us maybe feel like we're getting an energy hit to get us over a slump in the day. So because of the very nature of them, they're active for people to eat. They're usually easily accessible, and they may be something that people have just habitually added into their eating pattern.
Can the manufacturing process of food affect their nutrition?
Oh, in many ways they do, and that happens even in your house when you're cooking. So there are changes to the food's nutrient profile just by adding heat to the situation. So if you take some vegetables and you boil them on your stove, you can lose some of the nutrients that are in there naturally. And this happens to anything that we process in any way. So cooking is a process, and that can change the nutrient profile. So the best thing to do is to try and minimally process foods to get as much of their nutrition as we can. Having said that, though, in some ways we need to process the food, to cook it, in order to get the nutrients that we need. So protein foods, for example, like meat, fish, those foods in the process of cooking make all of the nutrients available in them more what's called bioavailable, which means we just digest them much more easily and we get the nutrition out of them that we need.
Is processed foods a real danger to nutrition?
Well, not if they're as part of a balanced eating pattern, but if all that people are using is highly processed foods, then yes. So I think of foods as unprocessed, so that means that they haven't been cooked or anything. They're raw foods. You might see that in like a salad, to minimally processed, and these are foods that like rice or pasta or bread or any of those sorts of foods, or your dinner meal where you've cooked your meat, you've cooked your vegetables that you're having. Those foods I call minimally processed, and oftentimes that processing can assist in the bioavailability of the nutrients in the food. But the other types of highly processed or foods or foods that you see that they don't even really look like their original constituents, those are probably not providing a lot of nutrients and are mostly providing straight out energy. So they can be part of a balanced diet, but you wouldn't want to be relying on them solely.
Are there any demographics within Australia that aren't really getting the nutrition that they need?
Yeah, look, there are some of them, and just off the top of my head, because I haven't looked at the data for a really long time, but there are certain groups like young men who were not eating a lot of vegetables. I think that was the age of 18 to like 24. I think they had the lowest level of vegetables. And there is data that says that very, very few Australians are meeting all of the dietary guidelines, so meeting all of the food groups in the serves that we would like them to see. So I think there's room for improvement in most people's eating pattern, and I think that we all would like to perhaps engage in that, but there's a range of reasons why people put that on the sideline.
What are some simple ways and how we can get maybe some more vegetables and fruit into the diet?
The easiest way to do it is to actually have them available to you. So it's very hard to add extra fruit and vegetable into your eating pattern if you don't have them available to you. And a lot of times we get really excited and we go to the supermarket and we buy a large amount of fresh fruit and vegetables, and then we don't actually use them and they end up as food waste. So it's a balanced approach to making sure you don't buy too much, but you do need to have them present for you. You can add, especially vegetables, into most of the things that you eat, and you'll be able to increase your vegetable intake that way. And so, for example, what I used to do, and it's a personal example, and I know this is not very original. I know lots of people do things like this, but I used to grate vegetables into my bolognese sauces and into my casseroles and those sorts of foods when I was cooking dinner for my kids. So you can add in quite a bit of extra vegetables when you're just a bit creative in finding ways to add them into what you're actually already eating.
Can poor nutrition lead to mental health problems?
I don't. It's a really interesting question. And I don't think that you could say it causes it. So I don't think there's any evidence that if you don't eat this or if you eat something else, that you will end up with a mental health problem. But I do think that if you are eating a balanced diet, that you can assist your mental health, keeping it at its optimum. And I think if you have got some mental health issues, that if you do have a balanced eating pattern, if you do eat lots of fruit and vegetables, as long as other health behaviours like exercise and sleeping well, I think they can assist you in your managing of your mental health problems. So it's not a cause and effect, but certainly if I would think that if you were someone who was worried about their mental health or had some signs that your mental health was, perhaps was deteriorating or something like that, then one of the things that you can do for yourself is look at your eating pattern and try and optimise the amount of fruit and vegetables that you're eating. There is in the literature some specific eating patterns that look to be quite helpful. So there was I think it was a trial done in Australia, and I think it was called the SMILES trial, and they actually had some really good effects by eating a Mediterranean-like diet with people with depression, and they got some really good outcomes. And I think that you can look at diets that are very high in sort of plants, so a lot of not to say that you don't eat any of the other food groups, but you have a very solid plant-based diet. These can be quite helpful when it comes to mental health.
Does climate change pose a threat to people having access to good nutritious food?
Climate change has a ubiquitous impact all across the farming and food sector. So it wouldn't be a blanket effect. It has different, some beneficial effects, changes to the amount of water in regions, changes to the temperature in regions, and it can have some deleterious effects. So it's a very difficult question to answer. But I think that anything that challenges the way that we are growing food, the way that we transport foods, the food supply into our major cities will have an effect on the food supply. And you can see that when it comes to cyclones, bushfires and floods in high farming areas. And it does directly impact on it. So, yes, I do think that climate change is a challenge for the food industry. It's a challenge for agriculture. It's a challenge for transport. And all of those things have really big impacts on the way that the food supply is experienced by everyday Australians.
You're listening to Wellbeing, a nationally distributed radio show and podcast. My guest today is Professor Lesley Wicks, where we are discussing diet and nutrition. Is there a link between poor nutrition and cancer?
Again, I think I don't think that you would say that there was a direct cause effect here. One of the things that we know is that you can increase some of the cancers that we have commonly, the breast cancer, the cancers that are more hormonally driven are obesity is a risk factor, those sorts of cancers. So that your diet can have an effect there. But I don't think that there's a direct cause. If you eat this or don't eat this, you're going to get cancer. The closest thing is looking at some of the processed meat, and I think people might argue that there was a very increased risk there, but it's not necessarily how I would look at it. I think if you are eating a healthy diet, if you're eating a well-balanced diet with a lot of variety in it, I think you go a long way to protecting yourself from many of the chronic diseases, and cancer would be one of those. But also now what we see, especially in the cancers that we have such successful early detection on, and breast cancer is a perfect example of this, what we're actually seeing is a lot of survivors, and I think nutritious eating patterns with a lot of well-balanced, again, wide variety of food can really help people when they have come out on the other side of their cancer journey. It can help with some of the side effects of being a survivor of cancer. It assists people in how they feel after they come out of a cancer treatment process. The other thing that we're looking at, and in particular in my research, is we're trying to work with the diets of people who have had a stroke. So we're talking about stroke survivors and looking to improve the way that stroke survivors eat in order to prevent second stroke. And I think we're developing evidence as we go in this research to see that if you can increase the amounts of plant-based foods, particularly fruit and vegetables, and if you can lower the amount of salt in someone's eating pattern, you can go a long way to reducing the risk of second stroke. So I think that in any of these chronic diseases, in the management of chronic disease and in people who are survivors of chronic disease, I think having a balanced eating plan is a really important step.
Where does nutrition sit when it comes to obesity? Are people that are obese, does that necessarily mean that they have poor nutrition, or can someone be obese and have good nutrition?
Well, obesity is directly a function of energy. So if you have more energy, if you eat more energy than you use, then your body will store it for later. The body is very efficient at storing energy, and in our body we store it as fat. And if you end up having a consistent situation where you eat more energy than you use, you will put on weight and you'll go through the stages to overweight and then into obesity. And so there is no doubt that food is related to that. But sometimes it's not necessarily that people are just eating energy-dense foods. Sometimes they're simply eating too much food in general. So they could be meeting their nutritional needs, but they're doing it in a way that is just simply too big portions, too much of any food, and they end up again in that energy imbalance. So it's very hard say that someone who is obese has not got some nutritional issues, because we would be looking at how their eating plan is leading to their continual weight gain. But they could be meeting what we would call their basic nutrient requirements. That's not to say that they haven't got a pattern of disordered eating, but they may not be in any form of nutritional deficiency. However, they could be. So it's really, obesity is a really complex issue. It's not a simple issue, and it requires a complex team of people to assist someone to work through their eating pattern and their other activities that are going on around them in order to try and help them manage that obesity.
Australians love meat. Is meat nutritious?
Meat's got a lot of nutrition in it. Meat's got a lot of energy. Meat's got protein. Meat's got iron and zinc. It's got lots of micronutrients present. So, yes, by definition, meat is a nutritious food. But in the evidence base, when we looked at that, that formed the basis of the dietary guidelines, it was very clear that you only need a certain amount of meat. So there's meat is one of those foods where it's very good for you, but it's good for you in small amounts.
So how much should we be aiming to eat then?
Isn't that interesting? I knew you'd ask me that question or a question like that. So when I'm talking to a patient and I'm thinking about the sort of foods that they're eating, we suggest that they eat sort of 1 to 1.5 serves. This is, depending on your life stage, this changes. But if you were talking about me as an older adult, then I would be looking to have about 1 to 1.5 serves of meat daily. Now, in that, those protein foods, I'm not just talking about red meat. I'm talking about white meat, and I'm talking about other foods with high protein contents that might be thought of as meat substitutes. So that could be legumes, that could be other forms of high protein vegetable sources like lentils, things like that. So 1 to 1.5 serves. So when I'm talking to a patient, I think that if you were to eat a piece of meat at the end of your day that was about the size of and thickness of your palm, then you're probably more than meeting your serving sizes. In the Australian Dietary Guidelines, we look at, depending again on the source of meat, about 5 to about 85 grams of meat a day, depending on the source. It's a bit bigger. If you're looking at fish, that could be like 90 to about 100, maybe 120 grams of fish. And obviously, if it's a vegetarian source of that protein, because we're looking for the protein here, then it might be a bit larger serve again.
Where does water sit when it comes to nutrition?
Well, we are largely made up of water. Water is very important, and hydration is a really key issue. And we would like you to be drinking about 2 litres of water a day, spread across the day in a variety of different ways. Teas, coffees, fruit juices, drinks of all sorts, but our preference is for you to be drinking straight out water. So hydration is an important way of ensuring that you function effectively. It can make, if for example, if you're dehydrated, you might be feeling that you've got a series of headaches and things like that going on. So it is an important part of anyone's eating pattern, if you like, and we always, when we're talking to people, want to understand what beverages that they're drinking.
How far has our understanding of nutrition come along, say, since when you first got into the field?
Nutritional science is an ever-growing and ever-developing field, and it constantly amazes me how much we are learning as we go about this really complex area of scientific discovery. So it changes all the time. And I know that really frustrates people because people go, how come it keeps changing? But it does. It's because food itself are very complex biological organisms, and how we engage with food and how we use food and digest food, all of these issues are really complex, not just biological functions, but social and cultural functions as well. So nutrition science is one of those fields that I think is growing and developing every day, and it's a fascinating area to be involved in.
Are there any particular areas of the field that we still need to do a lot more research into?
I think there's probably, any nutritional scientist that will talk about their area of expertise, they will all say, yes, we've got so much more to learn. And I think we really do. Complex, multi-cellular organisms and, two of them engaging with each other. There's always going to be so much to learn, and it's really quite a fascinating area. One of the areas that I find really, really interesting, and I think we're just starting to delve into, is the area of the microbiome. So all of those bacteria bacterial species that live within our gut, how that is interacting with how we function as individuals, as well as how we look to food, how we consume food, how we digest food, how we metabolize those nutrients that come out of the food. So I think we've got lots of work to go there, but honestly, even in the area that I'm looking at the moment, which is the role of diet in second stroke prevention, there's still so much to learn, and it's just fascinating about how something that we think of as so everyday and so basic, like what we eat, can have such wide-ranging impacts on the way that people feel and function.
From all we've talked about, Lesley, in this interview, what would be the take-home from this interview you'd want people to remember the most?
Yeah, look, I want people, two things, I think. I want people to think about food as the complex issue that it is, and to be really enjoying their food and with people, and the way they engage with food, to enjoy it and to enter into it in that way. And in that process, in that enjoyment, make sure that they eat a wide variety of food. Try some new foods all the time. Think about that different food that they may not have had for a while, or making sure that they have a balance in their approach to the foods that they eat, because food is a wondrous thing, and enjoyment of food is one of those really great parts of life. But we do need to make sure that we eat a wide variety of food from a wide variety of food groups, and that we keep a fairly good handle on that balance between the food that we're eating and the exercises that we're doing and the way our body is managing itself.
Well, thank you for taking the time to be on the show today, Lesley.
Thanks very much for having me. I hope it's been an enjoyable interview.
My guest today was Lesley Wicks, Associate Professor from the University of Newcastle. And if you like this content, check out the Wellbeing podcast for more. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.